Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're literally putting human nature under a clinical microscope. You know, as a society, we universally picture childhood as this time of innocence, right? A protected period of learning and play. But from a child psychologist's perspective, what happens when that innocence is just entirely absent? What happens when the developing brain of a young child is somehow capable of extreme, highly calculated acts of violence? Well, this is the terrifying intersection where clinical psychology, criminal law, and societal safety all collide, and honestly, often with devastating consequences.
Okay, let's dive right into this, because this question right here, it's the absolute core of our psychological autopsy today. Are certain children just born with a fundamental neurological void in their moral compass, making them inherently dangerous from day one? Or are they the tragic, explosive products of profound systemic failure and severe environmental neglect? As we analyze the clinical and legal data today, we're going to look way past the true crime shock value and break down exactly how society struggles to categorize, judge, and treat the absolute darkest juvenile behaviors.
So, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, when children turn violent. Second, developing a moral compass. Third, the nature versus nurture debate. Fourth, sentencing limits and loopholes. And finally, rehabilitation versus public safety.
Let's start with Section 1, when children turn violent, the historical and clinical stakes. Documenting and understanding severe juvenile behavior isn't just a modern phenomenon. It's a clinical struggle that dates all the way back to the 19th century and continues to heavily challenge experts today.
From a clinical perspective, discovering that a child has perpetrated a severe crime triggers a massive societal confrontation. We know that the frontal lobe, that's the area of the brain responsible for impulse control, empathy, and understanding long-term consequences, it isn't fully developed until our mid-20s. In fact, the neural pathways that allow a child to actually connect an action to a permanent, irreversible consequence simply aren't fully myelinated yet. Think of it like wiring in a house. The insulation around those brain signals is literally incomplete. So, when a 10 or 12-year-old commits an extreme act, we're forced to ask, how do we judge an incomplete brain? We have to move past our initial shock and look strictly at the clinical data to understand the root causes.
Moving on to Section 2, developing a moral compass, the clinical perspective. Let's look at how a moral compass is actually built and what happens when that development is violently derailed.
Back in 1874, during the trial of 14-year-old Jesse Pomeroy in Boston, defense lawyers used this term, moral insanity. They argued he suffered from an irresistible compulsion he just couldn't control. Today, child psychologists and clinicians have evolved that concept into diagnostic terms like conduct disorder and early-onset psychopathy. What this actually means clinically is a profound absence of affective empathy, an inability to process the absolute finality of their actions, or just a fundamental failure to grasp the concepts of right and wrong. As clinicians, we don't necessarily view this as evil. We view it as a profound developmental failure within the brain's architecture itself.
And this brilliantly illustrates Section 3, the nature versus nurture debate, clinical observations in action. This classic, yet incredibly complex debate takes on a terrifying weight when seen through real harrowing clinical realities.
Let's analyze the data from two extreme historical cases. First up is Amarjit Sada in India, who at age 8 committed multiple murders. Psychologists noted he derived distinct satisfaction from causing harm and displayed a profound absence of affective empathy. Innate psychopathy, right? Well, the clinical picture also shows he lived in extreme poverty and suffered possible severe neglect. Then we have Jesse Pomeroy, who at age 12 displayed terrifying calculation and planning, which completely strips away the defense of mere childhood impulsivity. Yet, medical records show Jesse endured horrific, severe bullying trauma due to a physical abnormality. So in both cases, we're seeing a terrifying cocktail of innate neurological deficits ignited by severe environmental trauma.
Let's jump to Section 4, sentencing limits and loopholes, the system's blind spots. We're shifting from the psychology of the juvenile mind to the blind spots of the legal system. How exactly do rigid, sometimes archaic laws handle cases that defy the very concept of childhood?
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the terrifying juxtaposition of escalating violence hidden right in plain sight. Looking at the timeline of Craig Price in Rhode Island. At 13, he commits a brutal, fatal attack. Then, for 2 whole years, he lives a completely normal suburban life. He plays sports, he's known as friendly and polite by his neighbors. Then, at 15, he strikes again, fatally attacking a mother and her 2 young daughters. From a psychological standpoint, this perfectly tracks the clinical profile of a highly organized offender who can completely compartmentalize his violence, seamlessly blending right back into society.
6. Just 6 years. That is the number of years Craig Price was initially facing as a maximum sentence, despite confessing to 4 brutal murders. Because he was arrested just weeks before his 16th birthday, Rhode Island law at the time dictated he had to be tried as a juvenile, and under that system, he could only be held until age 21. The rigid letter of the law saw a child, but the psychological data saw a highly organized, completely lethal offender.
This exposed a massive, absolutely shocking loophole in the justice system. The public was completely outraged, forcing society to realize that biological age alone doesn't determine someone's capacity for extreme violence. Now, while Rhode Island quickly passed new legislation to allow violent juveniles to be tried as adults, the Constitution dictates that laws cannot be applied retroactively. Craig Price had, essentially, beaten the system at the time, though his violent behavior while incarcerated did ultimately lead to extended adult sentences later on. But it forced a nationwide reckoning on legal blind spots and set the stage for the most difficult conversation of all. How do we balance the hope of reforming a young mind with the absolute demand for public safety?
Which brings us to Section 5, Rehabilitation versus Public Safety, the ultimate test. This is the real test of the juvenile justice system. Can the developing brain actually be rewired, or is the risk to the community simply too high?
Let's move to a direct comparison to see how this builds a picture of the system's totally unpredictable outcomes. On one side, we have Mary Bell in the UK, who committed murder at age 11. She served 12 years, was released at 23 with a new identity, and is successfully reintegrated. She hasn't reoffended, and she openly acknowledges her horrific actions without using her severe childhood trauma as an excuse. On the other side, we have John Venables, who committed murder at age 10. He was released at 18 with a new identity, but the system totally failed to rehabilitate him. He's actually been recalled to prison twice for serious child-related offenses. As psychologists, we view this latter case as a complete failure to remap the brain's pathways, perfectly illustrating the terrifying gamble of rehabilitation.
We can further see this complexity in the timeline of Jasmine Richardson in Canada. At age 11, she became immersed in dark online subcultures. By 12, heavily groomed and manipulated by a 23-year-old adult partner. She was actually convicted of participating in the murders of her own family. She received a maximum youth sentence of 10 years, which included incredibly intensive psychiatric treatment. Today, in her early 30s, she is living anonymously in society with no reoffending. Her case really highlights the intensely complex web of adult psychological manipulation, early internet exposure, and the sheer amount of psychiatric intervention required to untangle those influences under modern youth justice acts.
But cases like Mary Bell and Jasmine Richardson create a very specific, ongoing anxiety for the public, the invisible neighbor threat. You see, to protect rehabilitated juvenile offenders from vigilante justice and allow them to actually reintegrate, the law often grants them lifelong anonymity and sealed records. They live under completely new identities. For you and me, the general public, the real-world consequence is the unsettling knowledge that people capable of extreme past violence might be living right next door, going to the same grocery stores, completely undetected.
So, the crucial point is captured beautifully and tragically by journalist Geeta Sereni, who studied Mary Bell extensively. She noted, "She wasn't born violent, she was shaped by circumstances no child should face." That pretty much summarizes the almost incomprehensible burden of severe childhood trauma. It forces us as clinical observers to look past the monster narrative and see the shattered child underneath, demanding that society take early intervention and child protection much, much more seriously before the brain's developmental window closes for good.
Which leaves us with this final, really profound question.
when we balance a clinically developing, highly malleable brain against the absolute necessity of keeping the public safe? Where does true accountability actually begin? And when the absolute worst happens, can a mind broken so early in life ever truly be rewired? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking the hard questions and keep exploring the evidence. Catch you next time.